Hello.
Hello, Brian.
Hi, Matthew. How are you?
1 minute.
Okay.
I do this every time I forget to put my earplugs in. How are you?
Good, thanks.
Well, I want to start off by saying that I'd like to tell you that you're a hero of mine, but I'm not going to do that. And you know why?
Okay. No.
Because I don't want you to get a big head. Hey everyone, welcome to Encounters USA. If it's aliens, UFOs, Bigfoot, or Dogman you're looking for, you came to the right place. Now listen up as we listen to some of the latest encounters. Welcome to Encounters USA, and thank you for doing the podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Let me start off by just explaining to you and to people that might be listening for the first time, because you're going to bring a lot of people to my podcast. And you're probably wondering, as people who listen to my podcast and people who are listening, why is Brien Foerster here on a show about Bigfoot, aliens, and Dogman? And I think we're going to find out very quickly that it's basically all the same story. We may be talking about different things, but we're talking about how it's treated by science. When we're talking about the investigations and the research that have been done and the cover-up, it's all the same. So I think that people are going to find out very quickly, even though this is Encounters USA. We are going to spend a little bit of time in South America with Brian, but we are going to go up. We're going to look at things like the Lovelock caves. I always want to say Loveland. And we want to talk a little bit about the Egyptian mummies that you seem to, or the Grand Canyon Egyptian hieroglyphs and whatever artifacts that they say are or are not there. And so we've got a lot to talk about, Brian. And we don't have a lot of time because I promised you about an hour. So the first thing I want to mention to anybody who might be living under a rock is that Brian is he's a researcher and he's an author. And I want to mention you've got so many books. You have more books than dogs have fleas. But they're all great. And we'll probably be talking about Beyond the Black Sea, Lost Ancient Technology. I'm sorry. I'll only put the first part of that. Beyond the Black Sea, Lost Ancient Technology of Peru and Bolivia, and Aftershock. Because those are going to be all relevant to what we're talking about today. So, Brian, first of all, I'm just going to say welcome to the podcast. And how's everything going down there?
Very well, thank you.
Well, I've watched a few of your YouTube videos, and it seems like you're having some problems with your DNA samples. Is that correct?
Yeah, actually, we've done 2 proper testing of the DNA of the Paracas elongated skull people who used to live on the coast of Peru. The first major test was done with a couple of American authors and filmmakers, and the whole thing was had to be headed by a Peruvian archaeologist. So when he found out that the results didn't correspond with what he expected, the crew contacted him again and asked to do more sampling, and he said no, because all of the results you got have to be the result of contamination. And he knows fully well that that's not true. So that was simply him being afraid of the results and then not publishing them himself and denying the ability to do more testing in the future.
Okay. So right there, you heard it. Anybody who's familiar with the Bigfoot, I guess we'll call it an odyssey, and trying to get those DNA samples verified, same story. So first of all, did they know what they were looking for?
Well,
I'm sorry, I shouldn't. Did they know they were testing these mummies from South America that had very large skulls?
Yeah, because we specifically chose which ones we wanted to have tested.
Okay.
The problem is that initially the archaeologist said, I don't know why you want to do this, because German researchers have shown that the Paracas people and then the later Nazca people were related. But he didn't specify whether or not they tested elongated skulls or not. Mm-hmm. And that's the big key, because the Nazca people came later and they did not have elongated skulls. Mm-hmm. So for him to assume that they're related means that they were simply comparing the general population of the Paracas people with the Nazca people. Mm-hmm. And so when he saw that most of the results didn't back that story up, he backpedaled very quickly.
Mm-hmm. All right. So, Brien, you and I were talking right before we started this interview, and I had mentioned that your tests, from what you found, are similar, and not only the results but the treatment by the scientific community. So, and you told me you don't know anything about the Bigfoot results. So very quickly, and I'm no expert on this, you'd have to talk to somebody like Scott Carpenter or Melba Ketchum, and I'm sure she'd love to talk to you about what she found. But basically, what they're pretty similar to what you found. They are what you call Eurasian, Middle Eastern. Some I think some North African DNA, but it's almost identical. And we're talking about the female mitochondrial DNA. But basically, if you said, well, it's mostly Middle Eastern and Black Sea-ish, then that's pretty much the area. So what we're talking about today, Brien, since we've already got this out, is science says that there's a Homo sapien that developed from Cro-Magnon or whatever else. And there's nothing else, right? But we're talking about two completely different entities. One is a cryptid, and then one is a humanoid that lived in South America, and both of them science says does not exist. And what I think you're running into is the same thing that Bigfoot or alien people or Dogman people run into, is that there's just no credible evidence. And it doesn't matter how much evidence you come up with, because you're never going to get these people to say that it's credible. And as long as they can say there's no credible evidence, then there's only Homo sapien, there's only Cro-Magnon, and there's nothing else. And so the question is, and it's not a question that I'm going to answer. I wrote a 500-page book right here. I'll show it to you, but this is why. This is why they don't want you to know it. And I'm not really going to go into that right now, because it'll probably raise a lot of hackles, because there are things that they don't want people to know or think about. And and once you start to open up this this Pandora's box, you're going to start having people asking all kinds of crazy questions about who's man and who's on the earth and how many civilizations have actually been here. So because you found out. So anyway, let's just reiterate that science says there's Homo sapien, and you say there are these elongated skull people, and you're not saying are you saying they're Homo sapien?
No, actually, the morphological results of the skull itself indicate, according to medical doctors, anthropologists, and even chiropractors who've looked at them, they state that the position of the foramen magnum, actually, this is the book of the DNA results right here. Okay. That the position, and actually, I've got a skull I can show you here. This is an example of one of the elongated skulls. So the critical thing is this, which is called the foramen magnum. So in Homo sapiens sapiens, it's at the balance point, so it's more or less in this position. But in the case of the elongated skulls, it's about an inch farther back than where it should be. And they say based on that by itself, that indicates that these these were not Homo sapiens sapiens. They were at a minimum a subspecies, probably Homo sapiens paracas, who were able to breed with normal people.
Okay, so that explains why. I don't want to get off into this tangent right now, but we have to talk about it eventually. So when you look at those skulls, some of them are super duper big skulls, but then some of them are about halfway, somewhere in between, and those are hybrids. I know this is speculation, but
well, what the results are indicating is that there was an original population who were a subspecies, and they moved to the coast of Peru approximately 3,000 years ago from somewhere else, and then they were able to breed with Homo sapiens sapiens, and so gradually over the course of time, the shape of the skull began to shrink and began to look more human looking, and that's why the nobility decided to bind their baby skulls in order to maintain the design of the ancestors. And that's we see that in the archaeological record, because as time goes on, the skulls begin to look more and more normal, and then by the time you reach the Nazca time period, they are normal looking people. So that's a gradual loss of this ancestral design.
Okay. Now, Brien, you've a lot of people, it's very hard to keep track of how many cultures you're actually talking about. So I think the easiest way to keep track right now is we're going back to 3,000 BC?
No, 3,000 years ago.
Okay, 3,000 years ago. Now, if you are talking about, you do work up at Tiahuanaco, and I'm going to take a little pause here just to explain something to you. In, I guess it was 1994, 95, I was teaching up in Alaska, and they started coming out with these shows with David Hatcher Childress and Graham Hancock about how the pyramids are older and all these things that we were taught about history are actually not true, that there was possibly a super civilization that occurred a long time ago before the Bible says and all that. And, you know, I was raised, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, because this is like the elephant in the room kind of thing. And if you mention it, then people kind of, they get upset sometimes. But I was raised in a religion there. We had to learn a completely different history than everybody else learned. And we were told that, well, what they know is, they know a little bit, but they don't know everything. And what I was taught growing up as a young kid, and all the kids in my religion would tell you this, is that these people came from Israel and landed in South America. So you're telling me that these people landed in South America in Peru, and in this book that I talk about, I did research into a civilization at Caral, that somebody got off boats from somewhere and started building pyramids. So suddenly out of nowhere, these people just started an advanced civilization about 3,000 years ago. And now there are people that knew about this, but science didn't know anything about it. And when people talked about it, they said, well, that's a lie. That was all made up, stuff. So I guess the funny thing is that there are answers, there are theories out there, but you can't look at some theories. And you found that out. People have found that out for a long time. And then the ultimate question is why? And that's a much deeper issue. So with all of that being said, what is I kind of have gone off of track here. What is when we're talking about the cataclysm, your third book, or not your third book, but your cataclysm book, what is the cataclysm that you're talking about?
Well, basically, there's a lot of growing scientific evidence that there were a series of cataclysms that happened between 12,900 and 11,800 years ago. So a time span of about 1,000 years of where something likely came into our solar system and wreaked havoc. Some people think it was a comet. Some people think it was a meteor. Some people think that it was solar plasma from our sun. Others think that it was energy that erupted from galactic center. And so my book covers all of those possibilities. And as I said, there's growing scientific evidence that this series of events did occur, affected some parts of the planet more than others. And, for example, during that time period, the world's oceans rose by 350 to 400 feet. And so that not only would that have made ancient civilizations get drowned, as in so-called Atlantis, for example, but it also would have destabilized the entire planet and could have altered the axis of the Earth as well.
Right. So, Brien, I'm sorry, I got kind of off track here. What I want people to understand, though, is that when we're talking about these people with big heads, and I know you like to say elongated skull and everything, but we're talking about 3,000 years ago, and this cataclysm was 12,000 years ago. So it's very hard for people to keep track of what exactly are you talking about. And I think one thing that people should take away from what you're doing and what other people are doing is that in the Americas, people come and go. I mean, there have been so many civilizations that have come and gone. We have no idea. And I think we're just now starting to come to terms with the fact that we may be like millions of years old. So, all right. I don't want to get too far off, but I would like to make sure that we keep track of the time frame of the people that we're talking about, because that's very confusing. So, Brien, if you don't mind, we had talked a little bit about, I had heard a podcast of yours, and there was a couple of guys, it was a great podcast, and these guys, one of the guys had talked about being in Egypt when he was a kid. And he said that they went to some old tombs they were robbing, and he saw red-haired mummies in them. I didn't hear your reaction on that, but is that worth following up? I mean, could the red-haired mummy be something like those big heads we see? I think Akhenaten had a big elongated skull.
Well, he's portrayed as having one. His body has actually never been found. The Egyptians at one point stated that they found his they found his mummy, but that's not actually true. And the same thing, then they claim they found Nefertiti, which isn't true. So he is depicted in the artwork as having an enormous elongated head, and there has to be some symbolic reason why he decided to do that. It's unlikely that he had that, but he was probably trying to make a statement that that's where his genetic background came from, because he was immersed in the mystery schools of ancient Egypt, and so he was allowed access to any of the secret information. And being different from other pharaohs who were quite secretive and kept knowledge as power, he decided to basically give it to the general public. So that's why he allowed depictions of him and his daughters as having elongated heads.
Okay, but that's pretty much a theory, though. I mean, is that accepted? Well,
it depends who you talk to. If you talk to standard Egyptologists, they'll say it's just a representation of maybe his fantasy or his imagination.
Yeah.
But anatomically, especially the three-dimensional stone busts that were made of his daughters, they look like they are depicting something that physically did exist, because they're that well done. That I think there has to be a basis in reality as regards what Akhenaten was trying to depict.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess you would say it's circumstantial, but it's pretty serious evidence. I mean, who would ever think of just growing somebody's head like that. Yeah, and it is all circumstantial evidence. But from what I think happened, I think that those people were whoever they were, but they were a lot smarter than everybody else, and they were able to do things and rule people, and so they ruled at a time that we don't know about, so or know very much about. So anyway, so I just wanted to ask you about this, what this guy had said about they had found these red-haired mummies or whatever. So a couple of things about Egypt, Brien, I want to talk to you about. Is the first thing is I heard you guys talking about how you couldn't take pictures inside different places. Well, I had the same problem until I got into not the Great Pyramid, but the second biggest one. And the guy said, he said no pictures in where that sarcophagus is supposed to be, with the big chip out of it. And I said, okay, well, how much do you want? He said 20 pounds. So that was it. That was the story. So I think if you just give the guide the baksheesh, I think you can do whatever you want. And actually, there's two more things. When I went in that pyramid, it was freezing cold outside. And it was December, right? Freezing cold, high plateau, Egypt, and it was so hot in that pyramid, I was sweating. So have you experienced that?
Oh, yeah. It's
Where is that heat coming from? I mean, those stones should be freezing cold.
Well, we actually rent the Great Pyramid once a year when we go on tour. The next time we're going is in March. And so we pay $2,400 to get access to the interior of the Great Pyramid after closing hours for 2 hours. And you are right. As it starts to get chilly in the evening, then when you go inside the Great Pyramid, after 2 hours, it's almost unbearable being inside. So it's an incredible insulated building. I can usually manage like an hour, maybe an hour and a half before I have to get out. But it's it is a strange phenomenon that it is so much warmer inside, and it can't just be the heat from the 40 or 50 people that are in there. It's there's something else definitely going on that was probably part of its original function.
Right, but when you were down in Saqqara, you're looking at the base, and I mean, if that thing goes down far enough, it's going to get heat from the earth, won't it?
What is Saqqara?
Well, you went down at the base of I think it was Saqqara. You went down into a pyramid, into the base of it. You said it had been blown out. I believe that was the one. Anyway, but I just thought, wow, this thing is so deep into the earth that it's picking up it's channeling the earth's heat. So again, I don't know. It was just.
I think it's actually something else going on.
Okay.
Rather than that.
Okay. And then the last thing, as far as Egypt goes, Brien, is when we went to the Valley of the Kings, and we went, I think it was Ramses VI. I think I heard you talking about it, where you went in a long ways. And this is back in 2008. I have never heard anybody until I started saying this. I wrote my book and I put stuff on the internet. But I started saying that, how did these things get? There's no soot. How did they light this to put all these all the frescoes in there or whatever with no soot on the ceilings? And I had never heard anybody mention that till I did, and then you started saying it. So I think that's funny that kind of got skipped over a lot. So all right. So that's our Egypt thing, Brien. Now, before we leave Egypt, there's one other thing, and there are depictions in the on the walls of giants, like holding the electrical items. Right? Those are bigger people. Those are bigger people. Anyway, so what I'm doing is I'm just basically compiling a case of circumstantial evidence to say that that some of the things that we're seeing in America and some of the things that you're talking about could be in Egypt. And I'm saying that because I was raised to believe that people came from the Middle East and went to South America and built not one but two great civilizations, and the first one was 3,000 years ago. So that's where I'm coming from, and if you don't know the story, it's an interesting one, and people should check it out. So now going back to our red-haired giants. We're gonna take a little trip north, and we're gonna go up to Lovelock Caves. Now, Brien, how much do you know about any of that stuff?
I've read a fair bit about that because it's one of the most written about subjects in terms of there being so-called giants in the Americas, and supposedly there are stories, I think, from the Paiute people who say that their ancestors fought with giants, and they were actually able to trap some of them inside Lovelock Cave, and they lit a big fire in the front, and basically the giants died out inside the cave. But the question is, if it's true, then what happened to the bones? And of course, you have all the stories that the Smithsonian, especially in the latter part of the 19th century, made a crusade or a campaign to collect any evidence of giants and either hide them in the warehouses of the Smithsonian, or some people even say that they dumped them off the east coast of the U.S. because the concept of the giant doesn't fit in with the standard story of Homo sapiens sapiens. Mm-hmm. But there are lots of native stories, especially in the U.S., about warfare going on between very tall people and normal-looking Native Americans. It's not just one specific area, but many different areas. And of course, Jim Vieira is an author who's written extensively about. That's one of his big topics is giants.
Mm-hmm. So when we're talking giants in the Lovelock Caves, first of all, Brien, you sound like you're not really buying into the Smithsonian dumping the bones. Do you? First of all, I guess I have to stop. It's very nice of you to come on to this podcast because, when you're coming on a podcast that deals with aliens and Bigfoot, you're really setting yourself up. But we're not talking about aliens and Bigfoot here. We're talking about science, and we're talking about DNA, and we're talking about how this cover-up continues. So I really appreciate you coming on here, and because just for what you're doing, people are going to say, oh, well, now he's talking about Bigfoot, whatever. No, we're talking about species that they say don't exist that do exist. So that's one thing that I want to point out. Now, the Paracas skulls that you have, they're about 6 to 7 feet tall. Is that correct?
It's estimated that they were as tall as about 6'2", but that's very tall compared to a native South American person of modern times.
Right, and
which most average around. Most modern native Peruvians are average probably 5'3" to 5'5". So someone 6'2" would be maybe regarded as being a giant to these people.
Yeah, I would imagine you're a red-haired giant, aren't you? So
almost that size.
Yeah. So, all right. So the Lovelock giants, they were supposedly a lot taller, but we don't know that. They're supposedly 11 feet, whatever. But that's not. I mean, there's no. Is there anybody else that's 11 feet in the supposedly found book of undisclosed history besides them? Not
that I know of, and of course you need the physical evidence to prove it. And
right.
since it seems that major institutions probably collected any evidence that did exist and either hid it or destroyed it, then that's the one thing I'm still looking for when people say, let's talk about giants. It's like, well, I need to see a femur bone of that size in order to be able to prove it. The same thing even happened here. A friend of mine who's an anthropologist said, when I was in the highlands of Peru, he said there's a little museum that has a giant femur in it, and I said, can we go see it? And so we went to this little museum, and he kept looking and looking, and he said, they must have thrown it away or sold it or something, because it's not there anymore. And I do believe him, but physically, since the specimen wasn't there, then I can't substantiate it. I was very much looking forward to seeing that. Mm-hmm. But he also said that there's a cemetery actually on his wife's property that contains probably ancient individuals who were 7 feet plus. But again, he told me that 10 years ago, and we still haven't been able to excavate in order to be able to substantiate the claim. So that's the problem I have, because I do come from a scientific background, and so I need evidence and not simply a story or speculation about it. So
right.
I'm still waiting for that to happen.
Okay, well, I'm looking for two things here. The skulls of those Lovelock giants, were they normal skulls or were they elongated? Do you know?
I don't think they've been described necessarily as being elongated.
Okay, so they're probably not the same. Probably not the same people then. I mean, you can't have a elongated skull and be related to somebody who's just tall, but just very tall. They're probably maybe different people.
Sure.
So okay, and like I said, that's what I'm trying to make sure we don't do is to confuse people. Now the time period, I'm never really sure about. I've heard so many of these stories, like researching for this interview. I've heard so many stories about the Paiutes killed them and everything. But what is the time frame? It must be at least 500 or 600 years ago, and maybe 1,000.
Yeah, well, I would guess that it was obviously before any Europeans or people of European descent were in the area. And of course, that part of the West got settled relatively late.
Yeah.
So it is pre-European in terms of time. But then again, since it's an oral tradition and doesn't have any physical evidence that we know of, once again, you can't really substantiate it. But I've been spending time with Native people ever since I was very young, and so I always take their oral tradition seriously. Mm-hmm. It's just it would be good if it was actually substantiated by being able to see one of the skeletons themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but we're not going to, and it would be nice if somebody even just there was a depiction. But I think if there were elongated skulls in the descriptions that people that came out of the discovery, they would have said that, because they would have.
I would think so.
So they're probably not related to your people. So potentially that's a third group of human beings that for some reason or other got real tall all of a sudden. All right, so let's go and talk a little bit about the skulls in particular, and now we're going to start talking. We're going to go back into a little bit of Bigfootism, and it's just because people that study Bigfoot, they seem to think that Bigfoot has these abilities to do certain things. When I'm listening to these accounts of the Lovelock cave giants, who we decided are not your big heads, but they were supposedly able to look at you and kill you. They had some kind of mysterious superpowers or whatever. So what the Bigfoot and these giants have in common is just that they are giants. And now there was one other thing that when I'm listening to this is that they're talking about finding a huge skull with a huge jaw. And I don't know if you know anything about that, but I would look into that, and I would want to know if that was potentially a Bigfoot or a primate jaw. Mm-hmm. So there's all of that stuff going on, but at least we've decided that the Lovelock caves and your big heads are not the same. Now, going back to the shape of these skulls, it's all speculation, but do you think that, based on the fact that these other people were said to have been able to look at you and kill you, do you think a big skull gives you some kind of supernatural ESP powers? Is there any evidence of that?
Well, it's possible, because in some cases the their brains were 25% larger than a normal human being. And so that extra brain mass has to be utilized for something. So either cognitive ability or possibly psychic ability or both. We also believe that they were not warlike people. There are no depictions of that. I've never seen a tool that you can identify as a weapon to be used against other people. I mean, arrowheads can be used for killing rabbits, for example. And so it is quite likely that they were a peaceful people who migrated to the coast of Peru around 3,000 years ago. And that's also what the DNA is indicating. That's what shocked the archaeologist, and that's why a month after he got the results, I didn't hear from him, so I went to see him in his office without contacting him. I just, walked into his office and started asking him questions about the results, and he said, well, those results are not what I expected. And then I started to show him, he believes that all of the skulls are cranial deformation or head binding, but I've had numerous doctors now and other medical professionals look at what we call the original skulls and say, no, that can't be that's not head binding.
Brien, can I ask you, do you really think this educated person believes that that's a result of head binding, or he's just trying to save his job?
Well, yeah, he's just trying to save his job.
There's no way. There's no way that's head binding.
What I also did is I collected photographs of very good candidates of the most extreme elongated skulls, and I showed them to him in his office, and all he kept saying is, "Oh, that's strange," or "Oh, that's different." In some cases, there was a mother and newborn baby were found at a site near Lake Titicaca in Bolivia, and they're displayed in a very obscure little museum. And the baby's head is the size of its torso. And then the mother's elongated skull is at least 50% larger than a normal human skull. And I was actually there with an American radiologist, and I asked him for his professional opinion, and he said, I think they were mother and baby, and they both died during childbirth. And he also said there's no way that they're human. That's the terminology he gave. And that's from a radiologist who is an expert on the human skeletal system.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm down with all of that. But the question that I have is, I know a little bit about the brain. I know I had to take some psychology classes in college, and one thing that we know about the brain is that your occipital lobe connects in the back of your brain, right? If you look at those big skulls, they have huge eyes, right? And where's that occipital lobe? That thing must be huge. And then the rest of that, I mean, there's no way to tell the stuff. Yeah. And now the rest, that would be, that back of that head would probably it'd have to be that big for those eyes, to be able to take in the information from those eyes and incorporate it. And then the cerebral cortex, it must be huge, right? So I don't know these things, but if you just look at the mass that's needed for our eyes, we have small eyes compared to that. Well, they must be huge, and so who knows what they could see, how far they could see, et cetera, and maybe they could see other wavelengths.
Also, there's supposed to be a suture line coming down this way, the sagittal suture.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist in the original ones. And the funny thing is that nobody's been able to explain that. And until actually I had a brain surgeon on a tour with me in August, and he said the reason for the lack of that suture is that with it not being there, that programs the skull to form into the shape of an elongated skull, which I thought made complete sense.
Wow, that's an interesting experiment.
Yeah.
If you could find somebody that would volunteer their kid to lose the suture, then you could see what happened with it. Interesting. But then that would make it human. So,
well, no, it would make it
just
again.
deformed.
That's another example of how these people were not Homo sapiens sapiens, because that's not a feature that a normal skull has. So that's another factor for the idea that these were a subspecies. Also, there are two holes in the back of the skull here, and they correspond. They're called foramen. We have them in the front of our skull here, and so again, the explanation for why they're there is because the top of the skull is quite far away from where the nervous system is, and so they would be ways for feeding blood and nerve supply to the back of an elongated skull that way.
But that's not something that could, if you changed the suture of the brain and then the brain had to change its shape, it wouldn't be able to rewire itself with the arteries and stuff. You know what you were saying about if you took the suture away from the top, it would elongate, but still it wouldn't wire itself. It wouldn't be able to wire the arteries and everything to feed the blood.
No, but it's a separate feature which distinguishes the difference between a normal human and also normal human and what these people were. Also, there are these little tiny bones here that are all over the back of the skull, and they are related to actually the later Inca culture, because they're actually called Inca bones. They seem to be a genetic characteristic of the Inca people, so it's very likely that the Inca were partially descended from these people, because the Inca appeared about 1,000 years after the disappearance of these people.
Okay. So, Brien, you said that when we started that they were a subgroup of somebody. A subgroup of who?
Well, a subspecies of human being, because they were able to breed with normal people. So they couldn't be a separate species, but they could very well have been a subspecies. Okay. That's kind of the logical conclusion.
Okay. And what happened to them?
It depends who you talk to. The standard story of archaeologists is that the Nazca people moved south into these people's territory, and they intermingled with them and created a new group called the Nazca. But I believe that they were actually exterminated by the Nazca because we have a lot of evidence that climate change began to occur on the coast of Peru around 100 BC and gradually got worse and worse. And so the people who became the Nazca were forced out of their lands because they couldn't produce enough food. And they moved into this area, which is very rich in terms of agriculture. And so that's kind of a normal thing to do. If you're hungry and you can't feed your people, you invade another people's area, and the best way to dominate is to exterminate.
So you think that what do you call them? What do you call the elongated skull people?
The standard name for them is the Paracas.
Okay.
Because that's based on the location, and that's actually where I live.
Okay. So the Paracas people started around 3,000 years ago and lasted until about 100 AD.
Yeah, that's the standard chronology. However, the problem is they haven't done very much carbon-14 or radiocarbon testing of them because they don't have facilities for that in Peru. So they're speculating that that's how old they are.
Okay. And has anybody tried to date I keep talking about the Caral civilization. Is that part of this? Is that part of the elongated, of the Paracas people?
No, I'm 3.5 hours drive south of Lima, and Caral's located about 2 hours north, and it's been carbon dated at being 5,500 years old. So it's the oldest ceremonial city that's been carbon dated in the Americas so far.
Isn't that something? And but do you know who was living there? Have they found who that was?
Well, it was what they call the Caral Supe civilization, and the most interesting thing about it is that they've done full excavation of the site now. It was more or less discovered something like 20 or 30 years ago. They've never found any fortifications there, and they found a lot of evidence of trade. It's very close to the coast of Peru, so they found like whale skeletons inland where this site is. They've also found evidence of artifacts and animal parts from the Amazon jungle and also from the highlands of Peru. So it was a very complex trading civilization 5,500 years ago, which is probably the biggest shock about it. Because it is a big complex. It had to have been done by a settled, organized culture. It wasn't simply hunter-gatherers.
Right.
So that's probably the biggest surprise.
Yeah. Yeah, I cite that very heavily in my book by a guy named Sorensen. Did a lot of work on that culture. So, all right. So we kind of, I think we're kind of at a standoff, I guess, on the skulls, because you're not really aware that they're able to, superhuman powers, the ability to build things, to remember things, to see things in the future. You're kind of shying away from that?
Well, I have no idea, because they died out they died out almost 2,000 years ago pretty well. All that's left of them are their skeletal remains. Actually, they're subterranean habitations, which is interesting, and lots of artifacts that they left behind.
Is there anything to indicate that they were smarter than the average bear, the average person there, than the other cultures?
Well, this area is one of the driest deserts in the world, and so trying to survive would be very difficult. But they thrived as a culture for almost a thousand years. They developed the most advanced textiles in pre-Columbian Americas. They had knowledge of the potter's wheel. They seemed to have been working with bronze and silver and gold. Again, the royal people, who were like the elongated skull people, were the royal class. They were not the common people. Mm-hmm. And so they were, again, that's how they distinguished themselves from the common people, was having elongated heads. So in order to be able to grow enough food, they figured out that the water was actually traveling underground between 3 and 6 feet under the sand. And they were able to dig down to that level. And they made a huge series of above ground waterways in order to be able to maneuver. And some of those waterways are still being used to this day for agriculture. So that way they were incredibly productive in terms of agriculture, and that made them a target when the Nazca people decided to move into their territory, because the Nazca could easily take over their land and thereby become as productive as the Paracas people were.
Mm-hmm. Incredible. All right. Well, Brien, we've got about close to 10 minutes left, and I haven't even covered half of what I would like to talk about with you. The next thing that I would like to go into before I release you to your own devices, you do a tour down there, and I see you all over the place. If I go down there for a tour, where am I going to end up? Do you do all different places, or are you staying in Paracas, or where do you show? Where do you do the tour at for your hidden Inca tours?
Well, we used to do a lot of tours. Now we do three tours in Peru and Bolivia per year, one in June, one in August, and one in November. And in each one, we basically cover the same areas. We start here in Paracas, and then we fly over the Nazca lines, which are only about a 3-hour drive from where I'm located to the south. So we fly over the whole Nazca system and see other ancient sites here. Then we go to Cusco, which was the capital of the Inca in Peru, in the highlands of Peru. And we look at all the Inca works and Machu Picchu, of course, and the megalithic sites that existed before the time of the Inca. And then we go to Tiwanaku and Pumapunku in Bolivia, which again are megalithic sites. And so in total, the 3 tours cover 14 days each.
Wow. That is so amazing. And what's the price of the tour?
It's around $3,800.
Amazing, amazing. And how long does that last?
Well, the main tours are 10 days, and then the extension, which is Paracas and Nazca, is 3 or 4.
Wow. Okay. Boy, that's amazing. Is Ted Marr going down there? He invited me to go down with him, and I was wondering if he's going to do your tour. Maybe you don't.
That?
It's a guy that does a radio show up here. He asked me if I wanted to go down and do the tour, and I imagine he's going down to see you. So anyway, all right. So let's go back and talk about you're a big guy into talking about some ancient cataclysm. And are you familiar with Paul Laviolette and his blue star? Is that what you're referring to when you're talking about the thing that happened 12,000 years ago?
Yeah, he's got one of the theories, and so I included him in my book because I found that what he's talking about is very logical. And actually, I've been in communication with him relatively recently by email. What he actually did is correct some of my assumptions about what he has to say, but his basic idea is that the center of our galaxy is a black hole, and that for 13,000 years it absorbs energy, but then all of a sudden it'll erupt energy outward once it fills up. And so he thinks it's a 13,000 year cycle, and that again corresponds with the time frame of around 11,800 to 12,900 years ago. So I'm going to be meeting him in Laughlin, Nevada at a UFO conference in February for the first time.
Well, I cited him in my book, so tell him I said hello. I'd like him to do my podcast, but I know he's very busy. So, but anyway, even if you don't go into all of that stuff, the Canadian ice shelf, the ice sheet fell off about 12,000 years ago, slid into the ocean. So that may have been the catalyst for it. Who knows? But that rose. Without that catalyst, that rose the sea levels. They say 450 feet. So, without that, the only thing about Paul's theory was that I put it in my book because I wrote the book in 2010, and it was before 2012, right? And so he's talking about the blue star and things were going to happen according to the Mayan calendar. Well, that didn't happen. So I was a little bit upset, but I left it in the book anyway. It's okay. Maybe in another dimension, another universe, that did happen. So, and we just don't know about it. So let's talk about some kind of out there stuff right before you go. What about do you show these? I don't know where the portals are. Are you talking to people down there about the portals and stuff, or is that anything that you want to even touch on?
Well, there are these recesses in stone located in different parts of the highlands of Peru that most of them are megalithic in nature, meaning they're made of either very large stones or they're actually carved straight into the bedrock themselves. They're basically human size, so that's one of the stronger theories, is that they were used for ancient communication or energy transfer purposes. For some people that's going to sound kind of woo-woo, but they don't seem to have any other function, and we don't understand what technology was used to create them, because they weren't done with hand tools like bronze chisels or something. They seem to be incredibly ancient, and so that's one of the speculations, is that they were energetic portals.
Mm-hmm. All right, so Brien, what's we talked a little bit about aftershock, the ancient cataclysm. I wish we had a lot more time to talk about these books because I'm just fascinated. But you have Lost Ancient Technology of Peru and Bolivia. Is this megalithic stuff that you're talking about, or is there something else that you're talking about in that book?
Actually, I've got 2 volumes of it now, and I've also got 2 volumes about Egypt as well, and also a book about Petra in Jordan, which had to have been made with Lost Ancient High Technology, and another book about Baalbek in Lebanon, which had to have been done with Lost Ancient High Technology. So in some cases, we can tell what kind of technology was used because we have similar types of technology, like in Egypt and Lebanon and Jordan. But in the case of Peru, we see the work that was done, but we don't have any actual tool marks that we could tell. So that seems to be technology that existed far more advanced than what we have today, which of course scientists aren't going to believe in, but we do have the physical evidence, and they simply shy away from the subject. But that's another one of the functions of the tours, is to physically take people to these locations to look at the evidence. And nobody so far has said, oh, it had to be hand tools. It's like, no, somebody had to have been here.
Yeah, and I just want to give a plug for your tour because I've done the Egypt tour and a few tours, and what you do is you get the standard view of things, and when you ask a question about something, they don't know. They don't know the answer to it, so they either say, oh, I don't know, or they just look at you kind of stupid, or they make something up, which is probably worse than anything. But that's why your tour, I think, will be so fascinating, because at least you're open to listening to other people's ideas, and I'm sure it's a huge learning experience for everybody, and probably yourself too. Yeah. So so you think that they were just going crazy with these saws, right? I mean, they were cutting stone. They were some serious stonemasons, right? Somebody was.
Well, and again, it depends on where you go, but there's one location in Egypt called Abu Sir, which is one of the oldest sites in Egypt, and there we found evidence of the existence of circular saws that were 20 feet in diameter and 3/16 of an inch thick, and that's not a material that we have in modern times. Like that is like super technology, and we can tell that by the arc of how the saw was cutting. So we've been able to estimate somewhere in the region of 20 feet in diameter, and that's not something we have in the 21st century. So Egypt has tons of evidence of ancient drilling and saw marks and things like that, all over the Giza Plateau and at Karnak and other locations. The more I go, that's why we go once a year, because the more I look at these places, the more evidence I can find and document that this is the case.
So going back to this thing of you've got different civilizations doing different things, Luxor and Giza, same people? Speculation? Do you think?
No, it's not speculation. It's clear as daylight. You have the dynastic people, and then you had a super advanced pre-dynastic civilization. And the curious thing is, we do a Nile cruise, and so the farther you go south in Egypt, the more you actually get into the dynastic work, which is all limestone and sandstone. But when you're at Giza and Saqqara and Karnak and places like that, that's where you have work that was done in really hard stone like basalt and granite. And the dynastic people did not have tools capable of working those hard stones, and that's where we find again saw marks and drill holes and evidence of cataclysmic damage, because at Karnak they recently opened an area that was off limits before that have these huge statues made out of quartzite, which is a very hard stone, and like arms are blown off and faces are partially blown off. It's not damage done by an invading army. It had to have been some kind of cataclysmic series of events that hit Egypt and wiped out whoever was there.
Amazing. All right. So this is the last thing I'm going to ask you, Brien. And again, thank you for being on a show that has Bigfoot, aliens, and Dogman in the title. I hope you understand this is more of a scientific inquiry than one of these woo things. But now we're going to go a little bit, and Ron Moorhead was the person who introduced me to the term woo when talking about Bigfoot. But what about remote viewing? Do you ever listen to any people that have, like the Far Sight, they've remote viewed the construction of the pyramids and stuff? You ever listen to any of that stuff?
Sure. And actually, I think a lot. I think a lot of it is credible. I think some people do have that capability.
Yeah.
I mean, if the military uses it, then obviously it has to be functional.
Well, it comes up with some very interesting things when it comes to the pyramid, because I don't know if you've heard that particular one, but they're talking about alien races working with humans, convincing them these pyramids are in their best interest, and then they're genetically modifying these creatures that can only handle what's happening in the base of the pyramid, because these chemicals and rocks are being cooked using like nuclear devices. So have you heard any of that?
No, I've heard that theories that the Great Pyramids were energy stations of some kind, which is what I believe. They weren't made as tombs for pharaohs, obviously, because the dynastic people didn't have the capability of constructing the Great Pyramid. It's simply impossible. Yeah. So they inherited all of these things. They inherited the Sphinx. They inherited what are called the 100-ton boxes in the subterranean tunnels of the Serapeum at Saqqara. Like, it's, again, the difference between what the dynastic people could do and what they couldn't do are night and day.
Yeah. Yeah, it was funny. We'd run into somebody from the Egyptian ministry, and I asked her, I said, all right, who built them? She said, we don't know. So, first one I ever heard say that. She said, we don't know.
That's good.
I said, we don't know. So,
well, actually, the great thing about Egypt, though, is that they're opening up places that were previously off limits. So there's one thing I've been in twice so far, which is called the Osiris Shaft on the Giza Plateau. And it's a three-level series of chambers in the bedrock that go down a total of 200 feet into the bedrock. And again, that's something that we rent for a 2-hour period. And that, if you only went to that site by itself, that tells you that there was a very advanced civilization before the time of the dynastic people.
Okay. Brien, we're running out of time, and I don't want to keep you over, but I would like you to mention Beyond the Black Sea. I only wrote the first part of the title. Could you give me the rest of that?
God, I can't actually remember the rest of the title. I've got a copy of it here. But
this is about your DNA, right? This is your DNA?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
And so, just to reiterate before we finish up here, that what we've kind of talked about today is that there are a number of different civilizations that inherited, lived in South, Central, and North America that were spread out over thousands of years. Some of them were big-headed people that people don't think are of the human family or of a different part of it. And unfortunately for Mr. Brien Foerster, all of the work that he's done, and I didn't even get into how great it is that you decided to do this. I would have loved to have done it. I just don't have the kahunas to put myself out there. But I love what you've done, and so many people have. But Brien has had the courage to point out the fact that we have separate species of human beings down there, and that ties into our idea of a Bigfoot primate living in North America. And we didn't even touch on aliens, but you guys are going up to see the Nazca Lines, so maybe another time, Brien, we can talk about a possible alien connection if you're into that. But I would sure love to have you back. Seriously, you're one of my heroes, and it took a lot for you to risk your whole career and everything else and go down and point out what's basically obvious. So, but the thing is, to give you a little bit of hope, is that I'm starting to notice that there are so many more people who like, I do aliens, Bigfoot, and Dogman, and there are so many people who take this as credible, and science is losing its credibility. And so people, if people are looking at you as a legitimate scientist because you're doing legitimate science, even though supposedly legitimate science isn't accepting that. So I just want to encourage you, please book a tour with Brien or buy one of his many books that are available on Amazon. And Brien, before I let you go, would you have any words of wisdom, any way to get a hold of you to do your tour or a recommendation for a book?
Sure. Well, my website is hiddenincatours.com, and that has like 7 gigabytes of information on it. Almost all of it's free, but that's where the tours are listed. That's where I've got more than 1,300 YouTube videos now, and my 37 books are there, but the books are also at Amazon in both ebook and paperback formats. So that's where you can find everything.
All right, and I'll also put the links to your books in the description on my YouTube video for this and the comment section. So, well, all right, everybody. Brien Foerster, thank you again for being on our show. I know you're from Canada, so I'll also say thanks a lot, for being on the show. And I sure want to have you back. And I've been watching you for so long. I don't know when you actually got started. I got into this stuff in the 90s, and I just think what you're doing is so fascinating, and you're really opening up another chapter in the human story. So we can't wait to hear what you come up with next.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Brien. And so for everybody out there, if you're out, especially in South America, especially around Paracas, with Brien Foerster, always watch your back. Thanks for listening to tonight's show. Please remember, if you've had an encounter, we want to hear about it. Go ahead and email us at encountersusa1@gmail.com or contact us at encountersusa.com, our website, and go to the contact form. All right, everybody. Until next time, be careful out there. And if you're out in the woods, watch your back.